The wind was a blade in the high passes, cutting through layers of worn cloth, finding bone. It carried the scent of pine and distant snow, and the silence of immense, indifferent stone. He had been riding hard, the spurs cool against his horse's flanks now, the tension in his shoulders a familiar ache. Wanted posters plastered the few towns he skirted, his face etched in rough ink, a price on his head. He lived on the edges, in the unforgiving raw of the land, where fewer questions were asked, and survival was the only law. It was in the skeletal grip of a canyon, huddled against rock like a discarded bundle of rags, that he found her. She was small, impossibly so against the vastness. Her head was bare, her scalp pale beneath the harsh light, stubble only just beginning to show, like frost on barren ground. No trace of the long, dark hair he associated with women from the stories, from anywhere. Her face, gaunt and smudged with dirt, was a map of suffering, drawn in sharp angles and shadows. Her eyes, when they fluttered open, were pools of deep, dark brown, holding a terror so profound it seemed to consume the light. She wore thin, foreign-looking fabric, torn and useless against the cold, and her feet, bare and raw, were blue with the chill. But it was the scars that held his gaze, thin, white lines crisscrossing her arms, a jagged path along her jawline, disappearing beneath the collar of her dress. They spoke a language older than words, a history of pain etched into flesh. She made no sound, no plea, simply watched him with the wide, desperate eyes of a trapped animal. He knew that look. He had seen it in his own reflection more times than he cared to remember. A wanted man had no business with such vulnerability. Compassion was a luxury that could get you killed. Every instinct screamed at him to ride on, to leave the burden in the unforgiving hands of fate. But the wind howled, and the small bundle shivered, and the scars told their silent, terrible story. It was not pity that stopped him, not entirely. It was something colder, harder, a recognition of a shared exile, a kinship born of wounds, seen and unseen. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, non-threatening. He approached with caution, his eyes scanning the empty canyon, listening to the wind that offered no answers. She flinched as he drew near, trying weakly to press herself further into the rock, but she had no strength left. He knelt, the leather of his chaps creaking. He didn't speak. What words could bridge that chasm of fear and despair? He just looked, taking in the sheer, stark reality of her state. No shoes, no name she offered, no hair to shield her from the elements or hide behind. Only the scars, and the silent scream in her eyes. He reached out a gloved hand, not to touch her, but to lay a thick wool blanket gently beside her. The choice was hers, survive or succumb. The canyon waited, impartial. He sat a short distance away, back against the cold stone, rifle across his knees. He watched her through slitted eyes, a sentinel in the vast, empty theater of the West. The girl didn't move for a long time, just stared at the blanket, then at him, then back at the blanket. The wind whipped around them, tugging at the edges of the wool. The sun began its slow descent, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and purple, highlighting the stark shadows. He offered no encouragement, no soft words. His presence was a hard, silent fact. Finally, with a shuddering breath that seemed to rip through her small frame, she reached out a trembling hand. Her fingers brushed the rough wool, hesitant, as if unsure of its reality. Then, slowly, painfully, she drew the blanket over herself. It was a small victory against the immense cold, a tiny flicker of agency in a life seemingly stripped bare. He saw the bare feet tucked beneath the wool, the raw skin protesting the contact. He saw the way she curled into herself, a fragile seed against the stone. He remained where he was, a silent guardian in the twilight. His past had taught him the value of patience, and the danger of pushing someone too soon. Survival was a slow dance, and this was just the first step. The night would be long, and the girl was barely holding on. But for the moment she had chosen the blanket. And for the moment he had chosen not to ride away. The silence settled, broken only by the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. She slept fitfully, small whimpers escaping her lips like caught birds. He did not sleep. The cold seeped into his bones, but his mind was sharp, his senses alert. He fed the meager fire he had built away from her, a small orange heart against the encroaching darkness. He thought about the scars. Not random marks, but something deliberate, inflicted. The shaved head spoke of shame, perhaps, or punishment. Her stillness, her silence, hinted at a trauma that ran deeper than flesh. He knew nothing of her world, these foreign lands across the sea, but pain was a universal language, understood by anyone who had lived long enough. He had his own scars, though fewer were visible. They were etched into his soul, the price of choices made and paths taken. He was wanted for reasons he deemed necessary, for survival in a world that gave no quarter. He didn't see himself as a savior, or even a particularly good man. He was simply a man who had found another soul cast adrift in the same unforgiving current. When dawn broke, painting the sky in pale, hopeful colors that mocked the reality of their situation, she was awake, still huddled in the blanket, watching him with those dark, fathomless eyes. He caught a rabbit he had snared before dawn, cleaned it with practiced efficiency, and roasted it over the fire. The smell was rich, inviting. He tore off a piece and offered it to her. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, her movements still slow, hesitant. She ate it delicately, small bites, her eyes never leaving his face. He ate his own portion, watching the canyon awaken, listening. Silence. Stillness. Only the wind and the crackle of the fire. He didn't press her for a name, for answers. Names felt unimportant here, in this place stripped down to bone and rock. What mattered was breath in her lungs, the slow return of color to her face. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the sharp, assessing gaze that took everything in. She was not weak, not truly. Wounded, yes. Stripped bare, yes. But not weak. The resilience was there, hidden beneath layers of fear and pain, like a spark waiting for air. He stayed for 3 days in the canyon. He found water, taught her how to warm stones by the fire and wrap them in cloth for her feet, showed her which sparse plants were safe to eat. Their communication was limited to gestures, to his quiet instructions and her silent, observant compliance. He noticed the careful way she moved, favoring one arm slightly, the almost imperceptible wince when she stretched. More hidden damage. He crafted crude moccasins for her feet from a piece of spare canvas and some leather thongs. They were clumsy, but they offered protection. On the third morning, she spoke. One word, whispered, barely audible above the wind. Arigato. He didn't understand the word, but the gratitude in her eyes was clear. He simply nodded. It was a start. Acknowledgement. A bridge built from a single foreign word and a shared silence. He knew he couldn't stay in one place forever. He was a moving target. But leaving her here alone was not an option that sat right. The canyon was safe for now, but it wasn't a future. He began to pack his sparse supplies. The silence between them now waited with unspoken questions. Where would she go? What would she do? The answers felt bleak. Then, as he tightened the saddle cinch, she stood, still wrapped in the blanket, the canvas moccasins on her feet. She looked impossibly small, but her shoulders were straighter than he had seen them, and the fear in her eyes was mingled now with a quiet resolve. She didn't speak, didn't gesture. She simply stood there, watching him, her presence a silent question, a silent request. The answer was as clear as the cold mountain air. He motioned for her to come forward, helped her up onto the back of his horse behind the saddle. She was light, fragile, yet she held on with surprising strength. He rode out of the canyon the way he had come, the girl a silent presence behind him. They traveled slowly, keeping to the less traveled paths, the high country where the air was thin and the land unforgiving. He taught her simple things, how to identify tracks, the calls of different birds, how to melt snow for water. He shared his meager food, built fires at night that cast dancing shadows on the rock walls around them, a temporary circle of warmth in the vast, cold dark. She learned quickly, observing everything, her silent intensity a constant companion. He still didn't know her name. It didn't seem to matter. She was simply her. The girl with no hair, no shoes, many scars, and eyes that held the weight of a distant ocean. Her scars were beginning to fade slightly, becoming less angry lines, more part of the landscape of her skin. But the story they told was still there, a silent reminder of the world's cruelty. They encountered others rarely, a lone prospector who eyed them suspiciously before riding on, a small group of riders in the distance, which sent him veering off the trail, leading them through a tangle of rough terrain until they were safely out of sight. He was constantly vigilant, his hand often resting near the butt of his pistol. He knew his face, or at least the rough approximation of it, was known, and traveling with her added another layer of scrutiny. A man like him with a girl like her? It invited questions he couldn't afford to answer. She seemed to understand, her gaze sharp, her body language tense whenever others were near. She learned to blend into the shadows, to move silently when he needed her to. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had been tempered by necessity, by the instinct to survive that burned fiercely within her. She was no longer just vulnerable. She was becoming watchful, resilient. One afternoon, they came across a small, deserted cabin nestled beside a frozen creek. It was dilapidated, the roof caved in places, but it offered more shelter than the open sky. He decided they would stay a few days, rest the horse, patch their worn clothes. As he worked, clearing debris, he heard a sound he hadn't heard from her before. Humming. A low, soft melody, foreign and haunting, like the wind through temple bells. He paused his work, listening. It was a sound of quiet strength, of a spirit not entirely broken. He looked over at her. She was mending a tear in her dress with a piece of thread he had given her, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her scalp was no longer just stubble. Soft, dark fuzz was beginning to appear, a promise of hair to come. The scars were still visible, but her eyes held a different light now, a steady, determined glint. She was not the same girl he had found in the canyon. The hardship hadn't destroyed her. It had forged her. He saw the quiet dignity in her posture, the unyielding spirit that had allowed her to endure. He felt a shift within himself, too. The solitary wolf had found a companion, and the edges of his hardened shell were softening, almost imperceptibly, in the presence of her quiet resilience. The cabin, though broken, offered a semblance of home, a temporary haven. They made it as secure as they could, patching the roof with branches, barricading the door with stones. The air grew colder still, the threat of a major storm gathering in the bruised purple clouds on the horizon. He knew they couldn't stay long, but the weather held them hostage. They spent the days in silence, punctuated by the crackle of their small fire, the rhythm of necessary tasks. She helped without being asked, her movements economical and efficient. She cleaned their few dishes with snow, gathered dry wood from beneath overhangs, her bare scalp exposed to the biting wind. He watched her, a silent respect growing within him. She was learning the ways of this harsh land, adapting with a fierce, quiet determination. She was no longer just surviving. She was finding a way to live. One evening, huddled by the fire, she reached out and touched the scar on her jawline, her expression distant. Then, in a low voice, halting and uncertain, she began to speak. Not in his language but her own. She spoke of a journey across a vast ocean, of hope that turned to ash, of betrayal and cruelty, of hands that took away everything: her name, her hair, her dignity, leaving only the scars. She spoke of being lost, abandoned, of cold and hunger and the darkness that threatened to consume her. He didn't understand the words, not the specifics, but he understood the emotion. The pain, the fear, the resilience. He listened, his gaze steady, acknowledging her story with his silent presence. When she finished, her voice trailing off, she looked at him, her eyes searching. He reached out, a rare gesture for him, and gently touched the fresh fuzz on her head. It was soft, like a bird's down. Then he touched the scar near her jaw. He didn't say anything. What could he say? His own past was a tangled mess of regret and necessity. But in that touch, he hoped she felt understanding, acknowledgement. She closed her eyes for a moment, a single tear tracing a path through the dirt on her cheek. It was not a tear of weakness, but of release. The storm hit that night, a white fury that shook the cabin and buried the world outside in snow. They were trapped. And as if the storm wasn't enough, a sound broke through the howl of the wind. Horses. Approaching. He stiffened, hand on his pistol. Who would be out in this? Not just travelers. These were deliberate sounds. He extinguished the fire instantly, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the faint light filtering through cracks. He motioned for her to be silent, to hide behind the broken wall. She obeyed instantly, her body tense. Ready. The riders were close now, their voices muffled by the snow. They stopped outside the cabin. Heavy boots crunched on the frozen ground. A rough voice called out, "Anyone in there?" He didn't answer. Silence was his best weapon. The door creaked open, letting in a blast of icy air and the faint outline of figures. This was it. The confrontation he had always known was coming. He had been running for so long. But now he wasn't just alone. He had her, the girl who had survived the unthinkable. And a fierce, protective instinct, new and strong, rose within him, eclipsing the old urge to flee. He would not let them touch her. Not now. Not ever. The first man through the door was silhouetted against the swirling snow. He held a lantern, its light casting eerie shadows. "Looks empty," he said, his voice rough. Another figure entered, then another. 3 of them. He recognized the look, hard, dangerous men. They weren't lawmen. Worse, bounty hunters, maybe, or just predators looking for easy pickings. His muscles tensed. Ready. The girl was a statue behind the wall, her breathing shallow. He waited, letting them move deeper into the cabin. The lead man raised the lantern higher, scanning the room. His eyes swept past where he hid in the deepest shadow, then snagged on the movement behind the broken wall. "What's that?" he snarled, turning towards the girl. It happened in an instant. As the man took a step towards her, the girl moved. Not a move of fear, but of calculated desperation. She grabbed a loose stone from the broken wall and hurled it with surprising force. It struck the man's hand, sending the lantern crashing to the floor. Darkness erupted, followed by a roar of pain and anger. Damn it! In the split second of confusion and dark, he moved. He lunged forward, his knife out, striking at the nearest figure. A grunt, a fall. The other 2 reacted instantly, guns drawn, firing blindly into the blackness. Bullets whizzed past, splintering wood. He rolled, using the broken structure for cover, his own pistol now in his hand. He fired twice, aiming low at where the voices came from. A cry, another fall. The remaining man cursed, scrambling for the door. He wouldn't let him escape, not to tell others. He lunged again, tackling the man near the threshold. They grappled in the snow and debris. A brutal, silent fight. He was stronger, fueled by a cold fury. It was over quickly. Silence fell again, broken only by the wind and his own ragged breath. He stood, listening. Nothing. Just the storm. He knelt, checking the men. They wouldn't be bothering anyone again. He wiped his knife clean on the snow. "It's over," he said, his voice rough. He turned towards where she was hidden. "You can come out," she emerged slowly, her eyes wide, scanning the dark cabin. She saw the bodies, the scattered debris. Her face was pale, but there was no scream, no collapse. Just a quiet, steady gaze. She had faced down her fear, not just for herself, but for him. In that moment, the transformation was complete. The vulnerable girl was gone, replaced by a woman forged in hardship, resilient and strong. They spent the rest of the night in the cold, still cabin, the bodies a stark reminder of the world outside. In the morning, he buried the men away from the cabin, a grim task in the heavy snow. When he returned, she was sitting by the small fire he had rebuilt, the flames reflecting in her dark eyes. The soft fuzz on her head caught the light. The scars were still there, a part of her history, but they no longer defined her. She looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, she offered a small, hesitant smile. It was like sunlight breaking through the storm clouds. "Arigato," she whispered again, the words softer this time, filled with a different kind of gratitude. He met her gaze, a sense of quiet understanding passing between them. They had faced the darkness, external and internal, and emerged together. They rode out of the cabin 2 days later, the storm having passed, leaving the world pristine and white. The sun was bright, the air crisp. She was still on the back of his horse, but she sat taller now, her grip steady. They were a strange pair, the wanted man and the scarred woman from a distant land, bound by shared trials and unspoken loyalty. They had no destination, no plan beyond surviving another day. But as they rode, side by side in the vast, empty landscape, a sense of purpose, however fragile, had taken root. Her resilience had met his practicality, her quiet strength complementing his hardened resolve. She was no longer nameless to him. She was the one who had stood by him in the dark. And he, the wanted man, was the one who had finally found something worth protecting. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with unknown dangers. But they would face it together, two souls marked by the world, finding a quiet dignity and a shared hope in the unwavering promise of the horizon. Resilience, he understood now, wasn't about having no scars, but about carrying them forward, into the light.